Hello and welcome back to my channel and my Michael Powell retrospective. And now we've reached A Matter of Life and Death, one of the most beloved of Michael Powell's films and just one of the most beautiful and rapturous fantasy films ever made. I remember first seeing this film. It was the sixth film, I remember this, the sixth film I ever saw at the British Film Institute, the National Film Theatre in London. And I'd never heard of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. People forget these films were not regularly played on television. Michael Powell was not that well known amongst the public back in the 80s when I was a teenager. So these were a revelation to me, and I saw this film and I thought, my God, I never knew such a colourful, vibrant, confident, incredibly complex film could ever be made in England, of all places. I thought British cinema was really pedestrian and boring and sort of TV movie stuff. And to see this gorgeous, rapturous, confident movie out Hollywooding Hollywood, I just thought it was amazing. And I became a devotee of Michael Powell ever since. So you could say this is where I came in. The movie, right from the beginning, is so wonderfully confident from that opening sort of gag. This is a movie about two worlds, the real world and the one of the mind, and then the text starts moving up, of a young airman, which gives us a clue that this movie, a lot of people just see it as a fantasy, but actually it's a very true depiction of a certain kind of neurological condition. Pressburger's script is very thoroughly researched. I think the film critic Ian Christie pointed out how accurate the film is in its depiction of what's happening to David Niven. And all the way through the film, what is happening to David Niven could be an hallucination, could be something going on in his mind, although we of course invited to enjoy the fantasy as well. And then that opening sequence is gorgeous, isn't it? The slowness of it as it moves through the universe. And that wonderful, plummy voiced English narrator telling us, look, over there's some gases expanding. And there, in the left corner, is a supernova. All that sort of stuff. I love that opening so much. And of course, what this does is, it's a movie coming towards the end of the war. It's the last great propaganda film of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. And it places the war for the first time in a cosmic overview. It's coming to an end and we're sort of put at a distance from it. We go back through the whole universe and look down on the war. So at the end of this sequence, we come to the earth and we sort of look down on it like Olympian gods. And we see England and Germany. And he says, look, there's a burning city. And we go over the English fog. And that sort of idea of an overview will be rhymed throughout the film. So we'll have, Roger Livesey's character looking at a camera obscura, looking down on the village. The idea of heaven looking down on earth. The surgeon's light coming down over Roger Livesey's face and his great eyes closing in that wonderful special effect. So that's what happens. And then we come into that wonderful opening chat over the radio, which could be so ridiculous. But I think Powell and Pressburger pull it off between David Niven and lovely Kim Hunter. David Niven is, I think, really good in this film. He's often a very light actor who relies on his charm, but I think he's excellent in this movie. And it's kind of fun to see Kim Hunter, isn't it, in her youth, and to think this was the woman who would later play the female ape scientist in Planet of the Apes, and the sort of dotty aunt in the Columbo episode Suitable for Framing. But she's very nice, very sweet, and gives a great performance, I think. Roger Livesey is also wonderful in his third performance for Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. We have that wonderful opening chat where they kind of fall in love over the radio. Just listen out, there's a little interesting bit of dialogue in that opening chat when she asks him about his politics and he says, conservative by nature, Labour by experience. Very interesting that. Very interesting line from Pressburger. And I think in some ways sums up the politics of Powell and Pressburger. A little clue there to where they're coming from. And also, I think, where the country was coming from at the end of the war. And after all, we're going to move into a film where we have a very egalitarian and diverse heaven, where someone's going to argue, the person that David Niven chooses to argue for his life is just a regular guy, a country doctor. He rejects all the great philosophers of the past, all the great, Cardinal Richelieu and, all the famous politicians and warmongers, and says, no, I just want an ordinary man. So that's an interesting strain that's running through the entire film. But of course, he's supposed to die. And we go up to this very beautiful, that wonderful gag, that the world is Technicolor and the heaven is black and white, and we have that wonderful line from Marius Goring, "Ah, we are starved of Technicolor up there." There's lots of meta-cinema gags in A Matter of Life and Death. It's one of Powell's most playful films, and it's also very theatrical, actually. He sort of amps up the sort of theatricality and pantomime aspects of his filmmaking all over again. But what's interesting about that is that, so what happens is that he's missed in the fog. He should have died in this incredibly strange black and white heaven with that wonderful shot of Kathleen Byron framed like a halo. But he actually ends up back on Earth, and he wakes up on an English beach in Technicolor, and he looks across and he thinks it's heaven. At the end of the war, England becomes heaven. And it's an interesting heaven, isn't it? A heaven like the one we're used to living in. He moves across the beach, and what does he find? He finds a young naked boy playing panpipes, like the god Pan, surrounded by goats. A very pagan image, not one we associate with Christianity. Another clue as to the essential paganism of Michael Powell, the way that his paganism and his Christianity sort of coalesce in this vision of a very English heaven. And what's also interesting about this film is, not only does it present England as heaven after the war, place to come back to, but it also is about a recovering soldier who's been scarred by war. He's hurt physically, but he's also mentally hurt. He's struggling with incipient insanity, like so many people returning from the war, like so many men who had shell shock, or had PTSD, as we now call it. So there was a serious strain to this film that I think is often missed with all the Jack Cardiff's wonderful Technicolor cinematography and gorgeous effects. There is underlying this film something that many people in 1945, 1946 could key into. This was an important idea of people coming back to England and their home, and this is heaven, but they're not quite right themselves. The film itself is a joy. It's great fun. There's lots of theatrical effects, lots of use of special effects. Powell does everything he can, from stopping time, the wonderful scene when they're running down that huge staircase. It's a glorious exercise in filmic excess. And it's a great fun story. I was caught up in the love story. I don't mind admitting it. I was watching that opening chat again, and I was blubbing. I was blubbing all the way through. I'm a complete softie these days. So it's a gorgeous film. And then it comes to the big moment, the big trial. Now, you could argue that the trial is a bit stuffy. It's dumped in the film right at the end. But again, what's happening here, it's part of the propaganda. So, as we saw before with things like 49th Parallel and A Canterbury Tale, one of the strains of British propaganda was this bringing together of Britons and Americans, trying to make out to the Americans that this was their war and their battle, and trying to make them understand the English. And this is the last film of this kind from Powell and Pressburger. But typically with Powell and Pressburger, they do it in a completely perverse way. So they have an American, the first American shot during the War of Independence, played by Raymond Massey, putting Britain on trial. And it's done in this extraordinary way. Only Powell and Pressburger would make such a pungent criticism of Britain in what is a British propaganda film. So they show, for example, all the people throughout the world who have reason to have enmity towards the English because of the empire, because of wars, because of attacks made on their territory, whether it's Russia and China, whether it's the French, India. Extraordinary thing to do. And then it plays a really brilliant trick. So Roger Livesey has the chance to change his jury, that jury selection that you get in America. So he changes his jury and he says, look, let's have a jury then of all Americans. And of course, the same jury members, they're a very diverse jury members, French, Indian, Chinese, but then they all turn around as Americans, and they're Indian American, or Chinese American, or Black American, African American, or, French American. That's a very clever comment, this world of America is a diverse world, unlike Britain, which up to that point was not, right? So that's an interesting trick in the film. And then what is interesting about the jury, again, politically is quite interesting. Listen out for some of the dialogue. Roger Livesey makes a point of saying, you know, the Raymond Massey character says, we are here to fight for the law, that great foundation stone of American society and American civilization. But Roger Livesey says, we are here to fight for the individual against the system. And there you have, in a nutshell, the different ideas, at least according to the British, intellectual, of liberalism in the post-war period. In America, as the British saw it, liberalism was something that was enforced by a system. But in Britain, it is a state of mind. It's about the individual. And after all, this film is about a state of mind. The whole thing could be in David Niven's head, and in a way, what he could be doing is wrestling with himself, with what he's done as a British soldier in a bomber doing 67 missions over Europe, all the people he's killed, the violence he's been involved in. Is this trial in his head him coming to terms with his own guilt and needing to understand what he's done and why he's done it? Again, underneath this film, this sort of fantasy is actually a very serious idea. I get a bit irritated that people don't take Powell more seriously, because he did have very serious conceptions underlying his excesses and his very florid style. So those are some thoughts that I came up with watching this film. I mean, at the end of the day, the scene of David Niven and Kim Hunter with their cheeks pressed together, looking to the future, looking with hope, and then the last line of the film is, "We won," and she goes, "I know, darling." I mean, it gave me a lump in the throat, and I hope it did for you as well. Next time we'll be looking at Black Narcissus, and if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe.